Welcome to Monetize the Mic.
I'm Jessica Rhodes.
And I'm Margy Feltune.
And we are the co-owners of the award-winning multi-seven-figure podcast booking agency, Interview Connections.
This is the show to teach you how to transform your business and life with the power of visibility and strategy.
Let's get started. On today's episode, we have for you part 2 of Leadership and the Nervous System. This is Margy's signature panel where she dives into what the impacts of leadership are on your nervous system. And it features Margy and Elizabeth Kristoff and Brandy Olson, who are all uniquely qualified and gifted at addressing this topic. I loved part 1. It honestly felt like a personal coaching session. I related to it so much that I am thrilled that they are doing a part 2. And that's what you're going to hear on today's episode. So enjoy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this live panel. My name is Margy Feltune. I'm the CEO and co-owner of Interview Connections. And this is actually part 2. So we did part 1 of this panel where we talked about leadership and the nervous system. And it was amazing. And we also got a lot of interest and questions about the particular topic that we're going to zero in on in today's panel, which is how leaders can create psychological safety within their organization. So in the first panel, we had CEOs in the comments saying, okay, but how do we do this? How do we actually create the safety in our team? And it's something that both Brandy and Elizabeth are uniquely qualified to talk about. So we are going to dive into this. The premise behind this is, so Brandy and Elizabeth are both going to introduce themselves, but they are absolutely incredible. I work with both of them one-on-one and find what they do absolutely invaluable, because as we grow our team at Interview Connections, as we grow from a multi-7-figure company to an 8-figure company, it is a lot, right? The leadership challenges are really big. And I started to notice in myself the way that fear and threat responses and old patterning was holding me back from being able to be the leader that I wanted to be. And I started to see this correlation between diminishing leadership, like micromanaging and being controlling or not trusting the team, which are the things, you want to do the opposite of that for a healthy organization. And I realized that I think for myself and a lot of other leaders, when they are not being good leaders, it's not that you're a bad person or that you don't want to be a good leader or you don't have the best intentions, but sometimes our nervous system is working against us. So hence bringing together these experts in organizational leadership and in the nervous system to empower you to be a better leader, and for today's panel, to create psychological safety for your team. And we're going to talk all about what that actually means, why you need it, and really just like nerd out on this topic. So before we dive in, Brandy and Elizabeth, could you both introduce yourself and what you do?
Okay, I'll go. I'm Elizabeth. I am the founder of Brain-Based Wellness, which is a virtual platform that trains the different input systems to your nervous system so that you get different information coming into the brain and you get a different output. So I work with entrepreneurs, athletes, creatives to help them train their nervous system intentionally to be more resilient, to handle more stress, to be able to expand their life, their business, their relationships without moving into protective outputs, which can be anything from pain to migraine to dissociation to chronic fatigue. And how do you expand your life without moving into those behaviors at the level of your physiology and your nervous system and your subconscious mind? So that's what I really work with people on.
I love that. So I'm Brandy Olson. I am the founder and CEO of Real Work Done and the Olson Group. And we work with leaders to help them build high-performing teams that can solve any problem that comes their way and be incredibly adaptive as they respond to change and create change, so that they can do really great real work. And because high-performing teams are made of people, I am endlessly interested and fascinated with how we both think, how our nervous systems work, how our minds and our bodies come together, and the ways that we interact, because it's how we build teams that enable the right kinds of interactions is really how organizations like leap forward in terms of what they're capable of.
Amazing. So to kick us off, psychological safety, and when we were planning for this, Brandy, you pointed this out, is such a buzzword, right? Like people love to talk about psychological safety. How many people actually fully understand what that means, myself included? I'm not sure. So we're going to find out. So what does psychological safety truly mean within the context of an organization?
Yeah, so there's a lot of people writing about this and thinking about this. One of the first people who started really talking about psychological safety in organizations was a behavioral scientist named Amy Edmondson, who is a business professor at Harvard. And she defined psychological safety as really a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated or harmed for speaking up with ideas and questions or concerns or identifying mistakes. And I think that that's really core to how psychological safety or the absence of it shows up. Another author that I really love on this topic, Esther Derby, she talks about psychological safety doesn't mean that you're not ever uncomfortable, or it doesn't mean that you always will feel comfortable, but it does mean that you are able to be comfortable being uncomfortable in a really wherever, but especially in a team or in a work environment. I would love to hear. So like, that's how I think about it in terms of teams and organizations. And I'm super curious to hear how Elizabeth would define that from the nervous system perspective.
Yeah, I think that for me, looking at everything through the lens of the nervous system and our physiology, that psychological safety also has to rest on a foundation of physiological safety, right? And so our physiological safety is what happens at the level of our brainstem and our autonomic nervous system. It's not conscious, right? And it's what's always responding to our environment, to facial cues, to past experiences. And so I think in terms of psychological safety for an organization, I think creating an organization, just like you said, where it feels really safe to express your opinion, where you aren't criticized, can start to create that in an individual. But I think it's also important when we talk about creating a safe space for people to understand that the organization also has to like recognize like neurodiversity and have different tools available for different people, and also just neurodiversity much more broadly, understanding that all of us have unique past life experiences. We have past traumas that affect our behavior and that physiological sense of safety at the subconscious level. And so maybe also taking into account leadership that is trauma informed, understands how trauma lives in the body, and can start to recognize signals in different people when whatever it is maybe too much for that person's unique nervous system, because it's going to be so different for every individual based on their experience.
Yeah. And trauma informed is another, I don't want to say buzzword, but it's another thing that I think is starting to become a little bit more mainstream and well understood. So for leaders who want to become trauma informed, what does that entail, right? Does that look like education and formal certification? Does that look like just kind of self-study? What would you say leaders need to do, at least at a minimum, to be trauma informed?
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up because it's something I'm thinking about a lot recently. And I'm actually starting a certification with a couple other neuro practitioners to become like a trauma informed leader, trauma informed coach, trauma informed therapist at the level of the nervous system. So I've been thinking a lot about that because it's a huge buzzword right now, right? And I think the most important thing about being trauma informed is to understand that trauma does not live in the cognitive mind. It lives in the body. And it lives at the level of the autonomic nervous system, and it is a physiological event and that can be re-triggered. It's not something that you can override with your cognitive mind. And I don't think people need to consider themselves trauma informed only if they're able to resolve people's trauma. That certainly is beyond the scope for any of this, but just to be able to develop the skills to recognize, what does dysregulation look like? When am I pushing someone beyond their capacity into what I can recognize as what are the signs of threat that let me know the environment that I'm creating is not safe for this person? How can I start to read the body language signals? Are they starting to have trouble articulating? Is their voice starting to get hoarse? Does their vocal tone go up? Do their shoulders elevate? Are they having trouble remembering things? Are they having trouble expressing themselves with their facial expressions? All of these are cues that, like, I'm pushing someone into a state of threat. I'm pushing them into a state of dissociation. And I don't have to understand why that is that I'm doing that, but I could recognize and use those signals to assess and reassess, is this plan of action that I'm taking really working for this person, working for this employee in my organization?
I just want to pause for a second to see if Brandy has anything to add on that, because that's such an interesting thing for a leader to be attuned to. And I'm sure coaches and scrum masters and leaders, like the people that you work with, Brandy, that is probably a piece of their ability to succeed. And I would say maybe even under emotional intelligence would be this like trauma informed way of being and understanding.
Yeah, I think that it's something that can be learned. So you could also describe a lot of those behaviors as being really intuitive. Like I can intuit and recognize how somebody's responding to me. And I think sometimes we can be like, well, that's just not me. I'm not that kind of person. But being trauma informed or being aware of how our actions are impacting someone else, I think is a learned skill. Some of us naturally might just be more in tune to it, but it's also something we can learn and practice. And I think that's really important to understand. I think it also shows up in our interactions in organizations by recognizing that somebody else's actions aren't like I have this firm belief that nobody shows up to work trying to make somebody else's day bad or trying to do a bad job, right? And a lot of times when we lack the skills or we lack the knowledge or awareness about being trauma informed or how we interact as people, we can often make a lot of assumptions about people's personhood and their quality of character, when really what's showing up is a behavior or a gap in environment or a gap in experience. And so it's the real difference between, being able to understand that somebody maybe, is chronically late to meetings, and I could interpret that as, well, they're just really unorganized and lazy. Or I could look at that through the lens of, well, they might be operating on a different set of principles and values than I am, right? Like maybe they're late to meetings because they never want to cut a conversation short because they really value that. Or maybe it's some totally other reason. I think trauma-informed thinking gets us looking at why somebody's doing something and being able to recognize that. And I think that helps us see it. I also think it's helpful to know that like it doesn't have to just be about somebody's negative past experience, which, looking through a trauma lens tends to look at like the trauma, but how we show up and why we do things and why we're responding also is informed by our values and our culture and all of the range of our experiences. And those things are things we can learn. Those are skills we can develop as leaders in order to better understand how we're interacting and the kind of environment that we're creating, which then shapes how that individual feels, like their level of both physiological and psychological safety.
Yeah, that makes me think, Elizabeth, of one of the things you talk about, which is really common among entrepreneurs, but I think it's also really common among high-performing employees, which is the trauma response of doing a really great job, like being a super high achiever and a super perfectionist. And I just think it's so interesting, Brandy, that you bring up, well, it's not just negative things. And I think that's a good point, right? Because Elizabeth, I'm thinking of like, okay, if I see the person shutting down or dissociating, which all of that, like for sure is important, but are there other things leaders should be aware of that maybe aren't as obvious that high performing team members who may be in a trauma state might be showing that either I don't recognize this trauma because it seems positive, or it's in my best interest to just hope that it's positive and not look into it because it's serving the business, or it seems to be on the surface.
Yeah, I think that's a really incredible point. And it gets into like a deep level of understanding trauma because absolutely a lot of people who have childhood trauma and are kind of stuck in that state of hypervigilance lean toward being very high achievers and perfectionistic. And I would say you could start to recognize that with someone who has the inability to set boundaries around their work time, somebody who's always available for work, somebody that you can tell is very hard on themselves when they do get criticism. And those kinds of things lead them to be a big asset to the organization sometimes. However, I do really believe that at some point that response, while it is beneficial, will lead ultimately to burnout and will lead to an unstable work relationship that will implode at some point. And so when you're talking about like the longevity of your employee and employee retention, being able to recognize those things too is really important, so that you are maybe helping give that person tools to set boundaries around work, to be respectful of their time, so that you don't accidentally take advantage of those things and lead the person into a place that's unsustainable and possibly physically harmful to them in the long term.
Yeah, Brandy, I'd love to see your thoughts on this because, you are such an amazing expert in creating high performing teams. And sometimes when we think a high performing team, some of us might go to that sort of outdated idea of somebody who is so all in that they're working all the time. And so, what does that actually mean? Like, in terms of having a high performing team, if it's not that, which I think it's pretty clear that it's not, what does it look like? And what role does teams being able to play and rest and unplug, how does that correlate with a truly high performing team?
Yeah, that idea around like what does it mean to be a high performer is one that is steeped in a lot of like cultural messages and values that tend to surface in countries like the United States and other parts of the world that really tend to get in the way of, well, it can create our own trauma, right? So like the response of always doing more, always doing more, always doing more, and understanding that to mean high performance can be a trauma response from feeling like you're only valued for what you can create or your output. And I think that is a really short-sighted way to look at performance. In fact, like if you go to the dictionary and even like read what's the definition of high performance, the dictionary definition, and don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty close to being accurate. I'm not reading it from the dictionary. Most definitions of performance tend to be about a comparison between like doing better than someone else or another organization. And I think even in that definition, it like limits us to say that like, well, we can only understand performance in relation to if we're better or worse than someone else. I think it's much more useful and effective to look at performance over time and look and see that performance is about like sustained progress towards goals over time, and that it's a combination of both like efficiency and outcomes. Like it's about being effective. And in reality, overachieving in an organization, overperforming, actually gets in the way because it's a really ineffective use of time. Like I worked with, this was actually like 3 weeks ago. One of the organizations that I'm working with was working with the executive sponsor of this big new digital product. And the sponsor knows that they've got a lot of high performers on their team. And the team was bringing these really, really polished decks to the executive sponsor review every other week. And this executive leader, learning a whole lot more about some of the things that we're talking about, asked, how much time do you spend creating these really pretty decks to describe what you're doing? And a couple people on the team revealed that they usually meet 2 or 3 times, and they start prepping the deck the week before and just revealing how much time they spend on this deck. And he said, I want to be super clear. I don't ever want another deck like this again. that's not a good use of your time. And he recognized that like that overperformance was getting in the, it wasn't moving them towards the outcomes. So it was energy spent, but it wasn't really helping them achieve their goals. And it wasn't helping him achieve his goal of understanding what they were making progress on and what was getting in their way and how the product was actually functioning in the market. So I think that question of performance is just one that is so important to examine as a leader. What are your individual values around performance? What have your experiences been? And how might that be shaping the way that you define what good high performance looks like in your team and organization? And are you perpetuating perhaps ideas and values and myths around performance that are really causing harm both to yourself and to your team, and perhaps having a pretty significant impact on, like, if we come back around to like psychological safety and the way that people show up and interact? I think that's huge. And it's often something that we don't examine a whole lot as an organization.
Yeah. And before I close this loop on this rabbit hole, I'm really interested in, like, I feel like in this high achieving, overperforming trauma response that, like, I can totally relate to. I think most business owners can. There's also this kind of lie that I think is present in a lot of organizations that you really help leaders dispel, and so does Agile and so does Scrum, which is this idea that working longer hours or putting in more grind and effort is what leads to extraordinary results. And then as you get higher level, if you don't totally burn out, you end up realizing that you have to change that, because it's actually sometimes the people creating the biggest impact are not the ones spending the most time or exerting the most effort in the traditional sense of like a grindy type of effort.
Yeah, because there's a diminishing return at a certain point in terms of what we're capable of and how fresh our thinking is. And so just working longer doesn't necessarily mean we're going to get better results. In fact, it means that we're probably going to have to work harder and harder and harder to get like tiny little incremental gains. And it doesn't have to be that way, right? And the science doesn't really actually support that, which is a whole nother like fascinating conversation we could have, because I'm sure, Elizabeth, you could unpack so much about why that's true and what's happening in our brains. But yeah, I think that is just that idea that often I say, like, you can tread water for an hour or you can swim across a lake, and both exert the same amount of energy, but only one is actually going to get you somewhere. But you'll be equally as exhausted by either outcome, perhaps more so just from treading water. And so we tend to conflate busyness and exerting energy with outcomes and performance, and it's not actually the same at all.
Yeah, I love that. So, Elizabeth, coming back to stress, I'd love to talk about stress because, first of all, you're an expert in it, obviously, and this is one of the topics that you wanted to bring up. But I really love this too in this context of psychological safety, because we've all experienced different types of stress. And sometimes there's this stress that feels kind of good, right? Like you're in a high performing organization and it's like a little bit of pressure, but it's not a burnout. And then we've all experienced stress that feels really negative. And so could you talk more about stress and stress in the body and how that plays into psychological safety?
Yeah. So I think we really need to understand, like, stress is it's a physiological thing that occurs in the body. When we talk about stress, like, what do we even really mean, right? And so stress is it's a response to a demand that's put on our body. And as human beings, we are meant to be resilient, where our systems are plastic. We have neuroplasticity, they're changing, and you need a little bit of stress to cause adaptation. You need a little bit of stress. When you're working out, you create a little bit of stress, and that's what creates change in the body. And so we're meant to handle a certain amount of stress, and in short bursts, it can be really positive. Like, it will make you more focused, and you can feel your cognitive ability actually increases, and in short bursts it actually boosts your immune response. But when it becomes chronic stress is when that really becomes a problem. And chronic stress is when physiologically all of the time we're in a heightened state of threat response. And so our hormones like cortisol and adrenaline are getting pumped out. And these are hormones that are meant to prepare us for action. And so remember, stress also first comes from a physiological need to take action. So to, in an evolutionary perspective, to run, to fight, to take action and change a situation to ensure your survival. And so these hormones flip a switch that allows more glucose to get pumped into the body, into the muscles, because you need glucose for the muscles to contract, to fight, or to run. And your brain also needs glucose to function, right? That's its fuel supply. So you get more glucose coming into the blood, which is, again, fine in short little bursts. But over time, that leads to glucotoxicity, which damages your blood vessels, it damages your nerves, it damages your brain. And so it creates these states in our body where our vagus nerve gets damaged, where our immune system gets dysregulated. It leads to inflammation in the body. You start to see things like autoimmune. You see the development of cancer. You see mental health decline. And so our systems, our nervous system, our brainstem, our cerebellum understands at a deep level, we cannot stay in this chronic stress state. It is dangerous and it causes disease. And so your system will start to produce protective outputs to ensure that you get out of this state. And those protective outputs can look like anything from pain to migraine to fatigue, chronic fatigue, to dizziness. And so at best, we start to see these signs in people that are under chronic stress. They are either engaging in unwanted behaviors to regulate and get out of that stress state, like binge eating or drinking or cannabis use. They are starting to experience protective outputs like pain, migraine, chronic fatigue. And at worst, you start to see disease develop. And so it's really important to start to understand the neurobiological ramifications of too much stress over time.
Yeah. And we talk about kind of, as entrepreneurs, we talk about getting out of your comfort zone, right? And Brandy, we've talked about, as the team is growing and becoming agile, always being kind of on the edge, like not too comfortable, in a little bit of discomfort in terms of like growth and trying new things. So how does that balance with stress? Is that the same as stress? How can we expand and get outside of our comfort zone, but also not put ourselves in constant stress states by doing that?
So I think it's a good question, and one to really think about as a leader or a coach or anybody who's influencing the way people are working, because the goal is not, like Elizabeth said, like the goal is not to have zero stress in your life, actually, because that's a state at which there's no change and growth. And so as a leader, the goal is not to eliminate stress or to remove all discomfort. In fact, it's that, I call it like the challenge zone, right? Where this feels a little bit uncomfortable. I have to try new things. I have to engage differently. Like that's when we learn. And so when you're looking at your organization, you're leading, it's not to make everything comfortable or to remove all conflict or to solve all the problems or to make sure that nobody has a stressful day at work. That's not the goal. The goal is to really look at the whole ecosystem and say, is this the norm that we're always living in? Then that might be a challenge, or to recognize when somebody's moving out of the challenge zone into the panic zone, right? Because when you're panicked, you're not learning, you're not changing, you're just trying to survive. And that's where I think as organizational leaders, we have this huge responsibility to like look at the environment that we're building in our companies and our organizations that our teams are working in, and really work to cultivate a place that creates opportunities for challenge and innovation, but doesn't push people into a feeling of panic and threat, and being responsive as a result, right? And so it's not just a checklist of things that you can do. It's really about understanding how all of these factors play together, and that we're all individuals. So what challenge zone looks like for me versus somebody else might be different because of our past experiences. And so it's complex as a leader, but it's absolutely doable. And it's much easier and less complicated than trying to get humans to behave different than our biology. Like, it's so much easier to work within our biology and within our evolution than trying to create some organization designed for robots and machines. And it's so much more rewarding too, because we actually like accomplish more together.
Yeah, I think that was a really important point there too, about that everybody's threshold, their stress threshold is different, and teaching yourself to recognize, when am I exceeding someone's sweet spot and moving into diminishing returns and then into negative returns for the amount of stress, and how do you start to recognize that as a leader, and then have an organization that supports people at different levels of stress so that they can know that information for themselves and how to calibrate. And then also, I think it's really important too to have as part of your organizational culture, as part of what is available to people, understanding how to process stress, how to move stress through the body, because again, we are meant to experience stress but not stay in that state. But if we can develop tools to discharge the stress, then we can handle it. And the way that works for everybody is different. Different people process stress differently, but having a part of your education to employees, a part of your culture to be to educate people on different ways that they can manage their stress, that they can process stress, so that they can adapt in stress rather than shut down with it.
What you're saying, Elizabeth, really makes me think about coming all the way back to psychological safety, because as a leader, you don't have to be a mind reader. Like, so I think about, okay, if I lead a team of 10 people, or I lead an organization of 100 teams and several thousand people, being able to intuitively understand and read all those signs and signals and know that everybody's on this very different spectrum could quickly become overwhelming. And you don't actually have to be a mind reader as a leader. In fact, if you're cultivating that psychological safety, which if we go back to like that definition, it's really just the belief that you're not going to be punished for speaking up, asking questions, or saying, I'm stressed, or I've got too much on my plate, or I have a better idea about a way we could get out of like treading water so much here and start to move forward. So if you work to cultivate that environment of psychological safety in your organization, then people will speak up, right? And can identify for themselves on their team and tell you what they need to do their very best work. And then you're freed from the responsibility of the leader is like figuring that all out all of the time. But you won't get that if you don't have psychological safety, if you don't really pay attention to cultivating that. And the time to cultivate it isn't that it's really hard to cultivate psychological safety when everybody is in that zone of panic. Because again, we're focused on survival at that point. So cultivating psychological safety happens in a lot of small ways over time, not in big dramatic shifts and changes. But that's kind of the foundation that allows people to show up as real people with everything that means, and figure out how to navigate the work that they have to do together.
I love that point, because I think for people like me who have delicate nervous systems and can veer towards hypervigilance, I really appreciate you saying that, Brandy, because I do think it could go to this place of like, are they safe? Are they safe? Are they like, do they feel safe? Like, is everybody okay? Is everybody okay? Which like in itself would be like kind of a threat response, if I'm understanding that correctly, Elizabeth, like kind of a trauma response of making sure everyone's okay. So I love this point of like, you're creating an ecosystem where people will tell you if they're not okay. And then you don't have to be hyper vigilant and worrying if everyone's okay. So I think that's such a beautiful point. And coming back to psychological safety, Brandy, I want to talk about, so it's a buzzword, it's super popular. why does psychological safety matter so much?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's important to remember with psychological safety is it's not a binary. It's not like either you're psychologically safe or you have psychological safety in your organization or you don't. It's a spectrum. You can grow it, it can diminish. And so there's always this opportunity to grow it. The reason it matters so much is because when there's a high level of psychological safety, that enables us to perform more effectively. It enables higher performance. It enables innovation. It enables problem solving. It enables learning. And, in the environments that most of us live and work and run our organizations, how quickly we can learn together about how to do better, about how to move forward, what to do, how to meet the needs of our customers. Like that's the real competitive advantage that any organization has. And so if we have an environment that diminishes our ability to learn together, then we're just constantly going to be fighting against diminishing returns on our investment. Whereas, so that's what high psychological safety can do. But as psychological safety decreases, it elicits a fear response, right? All those things that Elizabeth has talked about, where survival becomes the goal. And so it has a real impact on the way that we do our work, and what's possible in the way that we work. And that's why it matters so much. It matters because we're human beings and we should care about one another as human beings. And also turns out, the best way to be incredibly high performing and do good work and solve hard problems is to show up as a human being and work with others in that way. And if we fear being punished or having consequences for being human, for asking questions, for learning, for causing us to think about things differently, we're not going to bring that whole part. We're not going to bring that part of ourselves into our work and into our team, and we're going to find a lot of focus on survival instead of focus on growth and thriving.
Yeah, I think there's also such a great opportunity to have an impact as a business owner on the world here, because people spend so much of their time at work, probably too much. And I think we could do another panel on the time versus results kind of fallacy and how that really can play into the high performing trauma response. But people do spend a lot of their time at work. And we have a great client named Bessie Graham. And one of the things that she does is work with entrepreneurs to understand that to have a business that gives back in a positive way does not mean that you have to own a nonprofit or you have to give money to charity or have a one-to-one model if you're a product business. There's so many opportunities to create an impact on other human beings' lives. And I think this is such a big one. If you create a space of psychological safety within an organization and your team, for us, we have a team of 25 people, are spending most of their life working in that space, what is the impact, Elizabeth, that can have on them in terms of co-regulation and what they're able to, how they're able to show up in other parts of their life?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I was thinking a moment ago, if you have an organization that reflects a lot of unhealthy attachment styles, right? Or unhealthy family dynamics where there are, where it's difficult to set boundaries, where you're punished for setting boundaries, where you're punished for speaking your opinion, then of course that naturally triggers a lot of people who experience that stuff in their early development. Whereas if you are reflecting in the culture of the organization, an environment of psychological safety that reflects a secure attachment style that allows people to be sovereign and express their voice and not face repercussions, you are repatterning relationship dynamics for the people who work for you. And I also think too, if you bring into the culture of the organization and understanding, I think increasingly there's a conversation happening in the world about the fact that we are not just intellectual beings, but that we're physiological, that we're emotional, that we're spiritual. And if you start to bring that into the culture of the organization and help people just understand a little bit more about their own responses, a little bit more about how to be the experts of their own nervous system. And again, it's not about you recognizing that and fixing everybody, but it's about arming them with the tools and the information so that they can have some agency to react differently, to handle the different situations, to be agile, to be resilient in the face of change. And I think that by bringing that into the organization, that is going to give them tools and a framework and understanding of themselves and their behavior in a way that trickles out into all areas of their life.
Yeah, I think it's so amazing that a for-profit business can be generating profits and serving their clients and all that stuff, but also, I mean, like what you're saying, truly be a place for healing. And I think that's so much too. You both do such similar things in very different ways, but like because I work with both of you, I experience them so I can see the similarities. And I think Elizabeth, like working with you to like heal myself has been so great. And Brandy, I've worked with you to heal the business, and it really is healing. I think for leaders who realize that they need a different way, right? They need to become agile. They need to become human centered. They need their team to work in a different way to create a different culture. It's really a journey of healing the trust, healing the company. And so in that way, I feel that both on the individual level and then on the organizational level, so much of what you both do is around healing and healing human beings and groups of human beings.
I love the way that you frame that. And I think that that's really accurate. You think about trauma, and so many of us have work-related trauma or school-related trauma, about places and environments where we weren't safe, where we weren't encouraged to bring our best, or we tried to, and it wasn't welcome. It was punished. It was too costly and expensive to do that. And so when you can create an environment where people can show up and do good work, that taps into something very, very human about us. And because we're whole people and you don't actually stop being, you're not like a work person and a not work person, we bring that into all of our relationships. And so it is really powerful as a leader when you can create that environment for people to do good work, because honestly, there's an abundance of important work to be done. And we can't really afford to be going after that good work in ways that are dehumanizing and that diminish what we're capable of. We can't afford to do that as communities and in this world.
Yeah. I would love to talk about, Brandy, you talked about some of the, like why psychological safety is important and how it impacts not just obviously the energy of a group and what they're able to do, but then you see that in metrics. And one of those metrics is in retention. So I would love to talk about the impact of psychological safety on retention with both of you and kind of get your perspectives on that, especially right now during the Great Resignation. It's very relevant to business owners how to retain great talent. And this is a huge piece of it.
Yeah, there's some really important and I think fascinating research on why there's a link there. One of the stories that I think is most fascinating that helps really identify what's this link, right, between retention and real metrics of an organization. And it actually happened in the 80s and 90s, and it was with car manufacturers. But in the 80s, Toyota became really famous for drastically changing the way they ran their factories. And they figured out how to reorganize their factories in a way that really allowed them to increase quality and decrease costs. And it got a lot of attention because that's a thing big factories care about. But what they were actually doing was changing the way the work ran and the way that they worked together as teams. And so they were applying they were some of the early organizations that were applying a lot of these agile principles. So they're wildly successful. And they were very, very open about how they did it. And so they actually in the 90s, or this was in the 80s, they came over and they partnered with GM, one of their competitors, because GM really wanted to understand what was happening. And they said, we'll open a plant with you. We'll show you everything about the way that we operate, and we'll help you do it too. And so I opened this plant. It's called the Numi plant. And it was incredibly successful. And one of the reasons it was really successful, and one of the reasons Toyota was really successful, is they had this mantra that was called stop and fix. And they told every single person who worked on their production line that if you see a problem, you are empowered to stop the line and fix the problem. Whatever comes after that, even if we have to stop the line for the whole day, you can stop the line. And so they implemented that in this Numi plant, and it was wildly successful. Well, GM tried to then take everything that they learned and apply that to all of their other plants, and they were wildly unsuccessful. So much so that they ultimately went bankrupt, had to lay off tons of people. And as people looked at what was different, like what was happening in that Numi plant and why wasn't GM able to replicate that practice outside of this partnership with Toyota, one of the things that they learned was in the other plants, they had a tremendous amount of turnover. So they had a lot of turnover, people constantly coming in and out, but then they dug deeper and they were like, but why? And ultimately, This American Life did a really great story on this a few years back. And ultimately, the conclusion that they came to was that the other GM plants lacked trust. And what made the Numi plant really successful and what made Toyota really successful in increasing quality and reducing expenses was trust. And it came down to this principle of being able to stop the line. And that in the Toyota plants and in the Numi plants, the factory workers trusted that they wouldn't be penalized for stopping the line and that they would be rewarded for finding problems in quality. And the plant managers recognized that if they could find those quality issues sooner and earlier, it would be much less expensive to address them. And so trust was the real foundation of that. And that was ultimately the reason why GM experienced a ton of turnover in a lot of their factories and wasn't successful. They had poor quality outcomes, rising costs. And I think that that's just a really powerful example because we don't often think about the role that trust might play in something like a factory, right? Or a production line. And, I think when we then try to take that to understanding, like, how does psychological safety impact the organizations that we lead right now? You can be sure that somebody who doesn't feel psychologically safe, the minute they have an opportunity to leave and care for their physiological needs, like a paycheck and food and paying their bills, they're going to go because our brains are actively working to get us out of situations that threaten our safety. And I think you see that over and over again. The numbers show it, and we can all look to our personal experience too and understand how that plays out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, it's really important to understand that at the end of the day, we're wired for survival. That is the primary that's the primary goal of the brain, is to always take in information, integrate that information, and make a decision, safe or unsafe. And it will generate outputs that reflect that decision. And if it feels unsafe, it's going to generate protective outputs. And if it feels safe, it's going to generate performance outputs, the ability to be connected, the ability to have focus, the ability to think better, to articulate better, to interact with more confidence, to have better memory, better movement quality, all of these things, right? Move into a performance way of being when the brain decides safe. And if it decides unsafe, then it's going to shut you down to reduce the amount of stimulus coming in, to reduce the threat, to reduce the stress, and keep you in that moment safe. And so when you're talking about not having trust in an organization, or going to a work environment every single day that raises the threat level that your nervous system is under over and over and over again, that's where you get burnout. That's where you get people who, are experiencing pain or experiencing brain fog, fatigue. There's been lots of studies that show low back pain as just one type of pain that people experience, but people have done MRIs, looked at people's backs. All of them have the same biomechanical issues. but only about 40% of them experienced the pain. And the one common denominator that they found between the people experiencing pain was dissatisfaction with their job, right? And if you think about that, if the job is, I would also bet that that job was very high stress, right? That it wasn't a safe environment. And so at the level of their nervous system in their brain, it's not safe to continue to go into that job. What's a great way to get you to stop, to change your behavior, to not go into the job, to generate pain? Because if you throw out your back, you're going to have to go lay down in bed, you're going to call in sick, and you're not going to show up for work. And so that pain is a behavior change tool used by your brain to get you out of that high stress situation. And so, I mean, if we're talking about retaining our employees, even at a subconscious level, they're going to have resistance to showing up. And then they're going to keep pushing through that resistance. And when they're there, they're not going to be thinking clearly. They're going to be checked out. They're going to be in survival mode. And eventually they're not going to come in at all because it's too much for the system. And that will always win. I will always win.
Yeah, that reminds me of that sort of like classic statistic of like the correlation between satisfaction with your job and the number of sick days that you take. And I think a lot of people interpret that as like, well, they're not happy, so they don't care. They're faking it. They're just like taking a day off and being like, I'm sick. And like sometimes maybe, but I think it's important to realize that like, it's probably more this, like they truly are getting sick because of the stress of the job.
Yeah. Stress is at the root of 75 to 90% of disease, and stress affects our immune system. Stress affects our experience of pain. These are all outputs of the brain and the nervous system. And so, yeah, those people are probably really experiencing illness.
Yeah. It's crazy. I hope that this is enlightening for business owners and leaders who are watching this, especially if you have employees who are maybe displaying some of these warning signs. They're out sick a lot. They seem to be closed off or overwhelmed all of the time. Hopefully this is helpful for you. What are some other, from both of you, what would you say are some other indicators so if I'm a leader watching this and I want to gauge how psychologically safe is my organization right now, what are some things I should be looking out for that are indicators? And I know you said it's a spectrum, Brandy, and I love that are indicators that you're sort of on one end or the other of the spectrum.
So I think it's really helpful to ask anonymously. There's some good survey tools based on the literature and research around like how do we define and understand psychological safety. I think as a leader, you may not always, so you can look at the psychological safety that you create, but it's also about peer relationships. It's about managers and other people. And so you may see behaviors that look one way when you're in the room, that wind up looking very different when you're not in the room or when you're not in the meeting. And it could go, positive or negative, right? But your mere presence as a leader shapes what happens. So I think it's really valuable to ask questions like, and I would ask them anonymously for purposes of psychological safety and hoping to get honest responses. But I would ask questions like, do you feel like it's okay to make a mistake? What happens when you make a mistake? And I just think that's really useful information. If you're trying to gauge like overall, where are we at, and try to understand maybe what's happening when you're not in the room. So I think that makes a big difference. I also pay attention to when you send out surveys, like if you are going to do organizational surveys, if all of your answers are positive, then I'd question the psychological safety of your organization. Like if everything's great, then I'm thinking somebody's not telling me the real truth, because there's always room to improve and there's always information there. So like if I'm doing a organizational like kind of health check or survey or something like that, or team health is another really great thing to be looking at. I want to see a pattern where maybe we start high and maybe we dip a little bit, because maybe that means people feel more comfortable telling us and speaking up about what's really not working. And then I want to see it kind of, go up and move that way. So paying attention to some of those things broadly, I think is helpful. Another thing I'd question as a leader is, do people ever tell me no? Do people ever tell me they don't think my ideas are good ideas? Just reflect on that, right? If you don't have anybody in your organization who's challenging your own thinking, they may not feel like that's rewarded, that maybe it's punished, even if it's not your intention to, right? So explicitly, you may want to create that environment that fosters trust and creativity, but you may have actions that are working in an opposite direction. So those are two things that come to mind. What else do you think about, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think those are really, really smart ways to look at that, is to one, ask, and then also gauge, how people are interacting with you. And if it is overly positive in a kind of fawning, people don't feel safe to express themselves, definitely question that. And then I'm always big on just looking at the outcomes, right? Looking at the outcomes that you are seeing around in your organization. And again, maybe that's part of having a little bit of an understanding of the nervous system, a little bit of understanding of trauma. But, does it look like people display healthy boundaries? Does it look like they are comfortable saying, no, I'm not going to show up to this event or whatever because I am doing something else? Or what are their work hours? How do they communicate with you? And I would look at things like sick days, and I would look at unwanted behaviors and outcomes. I really believe like we all do the best that we can at the level of our nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that on an individual level, and I also believe it on an organizational level. And so if you're seeing a lot of outputs in your people that could be interpreted as protective outputs, you're seeing people that have to take a lot of leave, you're seeing people that are very fatigued, that are expressing signs of burnout and exhaustion, then I would definitely question like what is the container that and what is the example that we're setting, and how is this leading to this here?
Mm-hmm. Another thing
sorry.
I just thought of another thing that comes to mind when you're looking at like trying to understand where your organization is on that spectrum. And that would be like, if you're trying to solve problems, like maybe you feel like you're not getting a lot of creative problem solving from your team, or things just kind of feel stale, or you are feeling like you're treading a lot of water and not making a lot of progress. There's likely more than one reason for that, but I promise you, in there is a level of psychological safety that's been diminished. Because when people do feel safety to ask questions, to be curious, to be vulnerable with their ideas, you will see the fruit of that work. And it may not be safe. The diminishing aspect of psychological safety may not be you as a leader. It could be a team member that creates a lack of psychological safety, right? That's highly critical or very defensive. They may be dealing with their own trauma responses to things, but they may be creating a dynamic in the team that is keeping people from speaking up and offering their ideas. They may feel it's too costly emotionally to engage with their team. And so those signs that you might not connect with as like a psychological safety problem are almost always connected. And it's a sign that you want to step back and really try to understand what's happening in your team dynamic and organizational dynamic.
Yeah. And I like that it comes back to the individual, which is what really part one, the first panel discussion we did is like those threat things. Like it doesn't feel psychologically safe to get negative feedback from your team. So even though you say you want psychological safety, you feel so threatened and defensive when you get, constructive feedback, that you're actually sending the message that it's not safe, even though you think you're saying that it is safe. And people, and Elizabeth, you talk about this a lot, like people co-regulate, people can feel, even if you're saying it's safe to give me negative feedback, they can feel if all of your body language and your tone and everything is saying it's not safe at all. Mm-hmm. This is a trap.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I always think, and we talked about this last time, like it always starts on an individual level. And if I want to create a safe environment, I have to start with creating safety inside of myself so that I can show up to places in a regulated state, so that the state of my nervous system, especially as the leader of the organization, is not negatively impacting the nervous systems of the people around me, because our nervous systems speak to each other and there's nothing you can do about that. It's going to be communicated at the subconscious physiological level. And even if you're trying to shine it on, there's a part of them that responds to what's going on inside of you. So taking the time and understanding how to regulate yourself and how to process your own emotions and stress so that you can show up as a safe container for people.
Yeah. So before we move on to like another topic of psychological safety, I want to ask something that is kind of a delicate thing. I've sort of been on the fence of like, should I ask this? But I want to, because I feel like for leaders watching, business owners watching, we're very focused on, how do we create this space for people? How do we not accommodate people, but create spaces where people feel safe? But there's also this other aspect, right? Because we as leaders need to be setting boundaries. And there are times where someone might not be a fit for the company, right? If every aspect of the job that just is a piece of the job, it just is what it is totally overwhelming for them, it doesn't make them a bad person, right? Everyone's, like you said, operating at the level of their nervous system. But there is a line, I think, for leaders in terms of accommodating people and doing everything you can do. And then also being honest if somebody really doesn't belong in the company or on the team and is probably having a detrimental effect on the other people around them.
Mm-hmm. You have to deal with that as leader, right? I think we oftentimes think about it as an either or problem, right? So like either I am creating a lot of psychological safety or I am having a like high performing organization that somehow like performance and safety and paying attention to all of those things are opposing, and you have to kind of choose what you care more about as a leader. But I think that really it's possible to have like high expectations. You don't have to lower your expectations for anybody. And also, if somebody isn't able to meet them and you're doing that good work of like understanding the whole ecosystem and all these things that we've talked about, it's just not a good fit. But that doesn't make that individual a bad person. It doesn't make them lazy. It doesn't make them grumpy, or, we don't have to add personal attributes to that. It just might not be a good fit. And that's really important to address directly. If you've done the work to create psychological safety, you can have a hard conversation. Because remember, psychological safety isn't about avoiding conflict, and it's not about making everybody comfortable all the time. It's about knowing that if we do have to have an uncomfortable conversation or there is conflict, I'm not going to be punished for it. Now, when you're talking about employment, that could still feel very punitive if the outcome is releasing somebody from their work responsibilities. But I think that when you're caring for not just the individual, but the whole organization, you still have to really look at that, because that one person on a team who isn't a good fit could be disrupting and diminishing the psychological safety of the entire team. And you have to address that. I really love the work of Kim Scott and Radical Candor. So if you haven't checked that out, I think she does a really phenomenal job of talking about this piece here. How do you have radical candor, give direct feedback, even make hard employment decisions while still creating psychological safety and honoring and being respectful of the people involved? So highly recommend that as a resource because you have to be able to, as a leader, look at the whole of the organization. And that's the difference, I think, between being a organizational leader and like being a life coach or addressing something, interpersonally. Like ultimately, your goal is to build an organization that can deliver on the outcomes and the value proposition that you have in the world. And so you may have to recognize that it's not the right fit for somebody, and they may disagree with you on that. And that those things can both be true, right? And you can still find a way to move forward.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that, because I just wanted to make sure we touched on this, because I didn't want this to skew so much in the creating safety and making sure other people feel safe that we have leaders who feel like they need to compromise their boundaries or their standards in order to do that. So I think is there anything, Elizabeth, you want to add before we move on?
No, I just think that that's absolutely true, and that it always ultimately is like I can't. It's not beneficial to the organization, to myself, and possibly to the other person if I'm constantly compromising my own values, boundaries, vision in order to accommodate this situation. Then that's not really healthy. That's not really healthy boundaries. That's not really healthy interpersonal relationships. And at the end of the day, that unhealthy foundation is not sustainable anyway. And you have to be honest about that.
It's like false psychological safety, right? Something can have the appearance of being like the kind thing to do, but it's actually not kind to withhold important feedback or to enable somebody's bad behavior in order to not have a hard conversation. But you have, I think it comes back to, like, Elizabeth, what you've said, like, you have to do your own work as a leader first. You have to do that so you're really grounded and centered and can take the leadership actions that are needed so that you can create like really authentic psychological safety, not just the appearance of it.
Yeah. And then it doesn't get blurred. Like you were saying too, about being personal. It's just about whether or not it's a right fit, and you can maintain the sovereignty of yourself and your organization, and then really just be honest in a compassionate way about what is right for the health of all parties involved.
Yeah, I love that. I think that has really rounded this out in a very balanced way. So I want to touch on something that we talked about before this, which is and is super relevant to any business owners who are watching, or any executives. How can leaders cultivate psychological safety, especially focusing on leaders who are leading other leaders or leading managers?
I have a lot of thoughts on that, right? And because that's a unique environment, again, because you're not like always there. So you're really helping to do that for yourself and to do that for the other leaders and managers so that they can do that in the parts of the organization that they lead. So I think about this all the time because it's a lot of what I do with leaders when we're talking about building high performing teams is helping them to really understand what are those actions and how do you create that environment. So I also asked this question on my LinkedIn page because I was curious. I wanted to hear stories from other people about when did they experience that act of leadership and creating that psychological safety for them as leaders that enabled them to then be courageous and do good work. One of the things that somebody wrote and I thought was really powerful was the times when their leaders modeled vulnerability for them and took that first step. And I think I would take that a step further and say, like, as a leader, both model and reward vulnerability. And so I use that word vulnerability to say, like, that is when we ask a question. That is when we get curious. That's when we talk about a mistake that we made. We're very vulnerable in those places because we don't know exactly how somebody else is going to respond. And so it's an act of courage. So I think as leaders, we can be really explicit about rewarding that, like, in talking about that with your leadership team. Talk about what vulnerable behaviors you actually want to see, because there's also boundaries in a workplace, right? So it's not about like oversharing or being vulnerable in ways that are perhaps inappropriate for a work environment, but being really clear about what that is. Like, how do we understand that together? Can we make it explicit? So like asking questions and giving feedback, receiving feedback. And I think holding your leaders and your managers to account for doing that. Like, so make it really clear that you have that expectation, that they reward it and they model it too. And so when you have that vulnerability modeled to you, then that's a cue that your brain takes that, like, this is probably going to be okay for me to mirror that back. So that's one thing. The other thing that I think is really important and really practical is for leaders to reward both vulnerability, but also reward learning, and framing the problems that you need to solve as learning problems versus just execution problems. And if you frame the work that needs to be done in terms of, like, what do we need to learn by doing this, then you've opened up two ways to be incredibly successful and two ways to have high performance, because there's the success of, like, did we solve the problem and get the outcome that we need? But also, what did we learn along the way so that we will solve the next problem differently? And when you can reward both the outcome and the learning that happens, like you create a lot more room for those vulnerable behaviors that lead to good innovation, right? So really focusing on what you're learning, how to learn, and to talk about that a lot. One last like example of that, and then Elizabeth jump in and share is, so one CEO I know, he created a Slack channel called I Made a Mistake. And I've seen other organizations do this with like oops boards or ways that they talk about the things that they're learning and the mistakes that they made. But the Slack channel was specifically for people to share mistakes that they made and what they learned about it. So making mistakes was not rewarded, right? It's not about being sloppy. It's about saying, what are we learning in it? And being rigorous about the expectation that we're learning with a level of rigor that allows us to improve. But what the CEO did was he was the one who was often adding his own learnings. So multiple times a week, he was starting the conversation going by sharing what he'd done and what he was learning. And that made it easier for other people to add to, right? So he modeled that behavior. So reward vulnerability, and I think framing things up and rewarding learning unlocks a ton of potential and a ton of performance opportunities.
Yeah, I think I was thinking along the same lines of one, starting with yourself and modeling the behavior that you want to see in an organization, but also to cultivating that very much in line with learning, cultivating a mindset of curiosity and making that such a big, important part of the organization, not just in my own life, looking at my own behavior in terms of curiosity, understanding that safety is my brain's primary concern. And if I'm acting in a way that I don't want to act, why? What's happening? How is that a survival response? And then in terms of the organization too, if you're experiencing outcomes that you don't want, if there's a environment of stress or there's a lot of emotional reactivity, or you're not seeing the level of creativity that you want to see, why? Why is that happening? And can we get curious about what might be underneath that, especially in regards to safety? Because again, individually or collectively, that's always at the root of it. And so cultivating that mindset of curiosity to examine why these things are occurring and helping other people to bring that into themselves and feel safe, exploring that in an organization. And then also too, I just really think that again, as I think there's an awakening in the world right now that we are more than just our cognitive intellectual mind, and that so much of our behavior, so much of our life experience is driven also at the level of the body and the nervous system. And how do I, as a thought leader, take in part of that conversation and bring it into my organization? And how do I address that? Because it's not realistic to say that we're operating from our frontal lobe all of the time and that we can cognitively override these things. And how do we start to take these new insights that are happening all around us and bring them into the level of the organization, so that it is a culture that looks at the body and the nervous system and arms the employees and the people that are part of that organizations with the tools that they need to process stress, to feel safe at both a physiological and a psychological level.
I love that so much. And I think that is a perfect place to wrap this conversation up. I hope that everyone found this valuable. I would love to hear about it in the comments, or send us an email at support@interviewconnections.com and let us know what you thought. Let us know if you have requests for another panel or what your favorite part was. And before we wrap up, Brandy and Elizabeth, could you both let people know how to find you? Because as I said in the beginning, we are going from multiple 7 figures to 8 figures, and doing it in a way that is compassionate and healthy. And we're focused not just on growth, but on healing. And I cannot imagine doing this without Brandy or Elizabeth. So I cannot recommend them both enough. So I want to preface their giving their information with that, like reach out to them.
Thanks, Margy. Yeah, you can find me at Hello Olson, HELLOOLSON. We're the Swedish Olsons if you are Scandinavian and you care about that. And then I'm also on LinkedIn, and that's probably where I'm most active on social media. So I would love you to come find me on LinkedIn and be part of the conversations that we're having there.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Margy, for that. And thanks for having me on the panel. It's always exciting to talk to you guys and interesting. It's so stimulating. You can find me at brainbased-wellness.com. That's my website. That's the best place to start learning about nervous system training and how to look at the world through the lens of the nervous system. And you can also find me, I'm probably most active on Instagram at EL Kristoff, KRISTOF on Instagram, and lots of information there too about how to train the nervous system and how to hear what it's telling you.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. And thank you everyone for joining us.